This is impossible. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane's voice cracked across the scrub-covered valley at 29 Palms. The 30-year-old Marine wasn't looking at his platoon of Force Reconnaissance Marines fanned out along the ridge with handheld counter-UAS receivers and advanced tracking equipment. His cold blue eyes were fixed on the empty sky where, moments ago, a simulated enemy drone had vanished without a trace, evading every sensor and every pair of trained eyes. For 6 hours, the Marines had tried to track and neutralize it. The drone seemed to anticipate every move, ghosting their sensors, ducking behind terrain, reappearing just long enough to gather intelligence before vanishing again. Harold Hank Morrison had been watching the Marines' futile efforts from his position near the perimeter fence, where he was trimming overgrown brush. At 78 years old, he looked exactly like his identification claimed. A civilian contractor responsible for groundskeeping. His weathered hands, stained with decades of honest work, gripped a pair of hedge clippers. He wore his usual faded red work shirt that had survived more wash cycles than most Marines had deployments, blue jeans with permanent grass stains, and worn work boots. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his pale blue eyes held the quiet intelligence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing subtle patterns in the natural world. Morrison had been employed at 29 Palms for 12 years, maintaining the vast training ranges that prepared America's finest warriors. He was invisible to most Marines, just another aging contractor keeping facilities operational. The Force Recon team had barely acknowledged his presence during their 6-hour battle with the Phantom drone, treating him with casual dismissal that young warriors often showed elderly civilians who worked around military installations. Staff Sergeant Kane finally noticed the old man standing nearby, silently observing. "Sir, this is a restricted training area. You need to clear the perimeter until we complete this exercise." Morrison nodded politely but made no move to leave. "Just watching, son. That's quite a bird you're chasing. Small, fast, and smart." His voice carried calm authority that seemed out of place from a groundskeeper. Kane's patience was wearing thin after hours of failure and pressure from battalion leadership. "Sir, I need you to move to a safe distance. We're conducting classified reconnaissance training with sensitive equipment." Morrison looked at the empty sky, then at the scattered electronic gear, then back at the frustrated Marines. "You boys are chasing it wrong," he said quietly. "That thing's not random. It's following the wind patterns and terrain features like any smart pilot would." Lance Corporal Rodriguez rolled his eyes. "Thanks for the nature lesson, Grandpa. We've got million-dollar sensors and AI tracking algorithms. We don't need a landscaping expert." Morrison's mouth tugged into a patient smile. "See that dust devil forming by the western ridge? Your drone will pop up there in about 20 seconds, use the thermal updraft to gain altitude, then drop into the shadow of those rocks." The Marines turned, half mocking, half curious. 19 seconds later, the drone crested exactly where Morrison had predicted, hovered briefly, then disappeared into the terrain shadow as if following a script written in the wind itself. The Marines stared at Morrison with new attention, their skepticism warring with undeniable evidence. Staff Sergeant Kane walked closer, his boots crunching on desert gravel. "Lucky guess," he said, but his voice had lost its dismissive edge. Morrison shook his head gently. "Not luck, son. Pattern recognition. That drone's operator isn't reckless. He's disciplined. He's reading the same environmental signs I am, using nature's highways to stay invisible." Morrison knelt and sketched the valley in the sand with a stick, marking wind currents, thermal columns, and terrain features. "Your bird runs this loop every 40 minutes. See? Thermal updraft here, ridge shadow there, then back to the starting point. It's not random flight, it's energy conservation and tactical positioning combined." Corporal Chen looked up from his sensor array with growing interest. "How would you know about drone flight patterns?" Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his bearing. The slight slouch of an elderly groundskeeper straightened into something that looked suspiciously like military posture. "I've been observing movement patterns for a long time, son. Different conflicts, different decades, but same basic principles." Morrison's mind suddenly drifted to another time, another place entirely. The California desert faded away, replaced by the dense, suffocating jungle of Vietnam. He wasn't 78 anymore. He was 25, a sergeant with 1st Force Recon Company, leading a 6-man team on a classified reconnaissance mission deep behind enemy lines. The year was 1969, and Morrison was part of the most elite reconnaissance unit in the Marine Corps, tasked with tracking Viet Cong infiltration routes through terrain where every shadow could hide death. In that long-ago jungle, Morrison had earned a reputation as the Marine who could find anything. He possessed an intuitive understanding of enemy movement patterns that went beyond standard reconnaissance training. Morrison remembered one particular mission where his team had spent days trying to track an elusive VC unit that seemed to vanish into thin air. The breakthrough came when Morrison realized they weren't moving like conventional military units. They were moving like the jungle itself, following game trails, exploiting natural cover, using patterns that nature had perfected over millennia. By observing disturbed vegetation, wildlife behavior, and subtle environmental changes, Morrison had successfully tracked the unit and called in air support that disrupted their operations. That experience taught him that patterns existed everywhere in nature, and human activity, no matter how sophisticated, still followed natural laws. Back on the Nevada training range, Morrison's eyes refocused on the young Marines. "The thing about evasion," Morrison said quietly, "is that it's still a pattern. Your drone operator is smart, but he's working within physical constraints. Wind, thermals, terrain, these things don't lie." Kane's radio crackled with urgent communication from higher command, demanding status updates on their failed exercise. Rodriguez studied Morrison with new respect. "What would you do differently?" Morrison pointed to specific terrain features. "Stop chasing where it's been. Start predicting where it's going. That pilot thinks he owns the wind patterns. Time to prove him wrong." Morrison stood and brushed sand from his knees, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Your drone will complete its current loop in about 8 minutes. Instead of chasing it with jammers, position your teams where it has to go next, the thermal column by that lone Joshua tree. Set up a crossfire pattern with your sensors, and when it pops up for its reconnaissance pass, you'll have it triangulated." Staff Sergeant Chen pulled out his tactical tablet, cross-referencing Morrison's predictions with their tracking data. The old man's description matched perfectly with the intermittent signals they'd been receiving. "Sir, that's exactly what our telemetry shows before it goes dark. How did you know that?" Morrison smiled with patient understanding. "Because I've seen this dance before, son. Not with drones, but with enemy scouts. Same principles: use terrain for concealment, exploit natural phenomena for tactical advantage, maintain unpredictable timing while following efficient routes." The confrontation had reached a turning point when Lance Corporal Martinez made a critical decision. "Staff Sergeant," Martinez said carefully, "what if we contact range control, just to verify his background?" Kane nodded grimly, thinking this would either expose Morrison as a fraud or explain something they were missing. Martinez walked toward communications equipment, but instead of calling range control immediately, he contacted Gunnery Sergeant Valdez at regiment headquarters. "Gunny, this is Martinez at Range 7. We have a situation with an elderly civilian contractor who seems to know advanced tracking patterns. Says his name is Harold Morrison." There was an unusually long pause. When Gunnery Sergeant Valdez finally spoke, his voice carried tension Martinez had never heard before. "Martinez, did you say Harold Morrison, working with tracking patterns?" The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. "Sweet Mother of God," Valdez said, papers rustling frantically in the background. Martinez, listen carefully. Do not allow anyone to lay a single hand on Harold Morrison. Do you understand completely? Martinez felt his stomach drop. Gunny, what's happening here? I'm making urgent calls immediately. That man is definitely not a confused civilian contractor. Keep everything calm until I arrive personally. Morrison had quietly positioned himself where he could observe both the Marines and the predicted drone appearance point. In about 90 seconds, your bird will try the thermal column again. Don't jam where it is, jam where it's going to be. And have your visual observers ready for the exit route through that saddle. Before anyone could respond fully, they heard multiple vehicles approaching at high speed across the base. Heavy engines pushed to their limits, creating massive dust clouds visible across the training area. Morrison remained exactly where he'd been throughout the confrontation, patient, methodical, still observing the environmental signs that told the story of wind and terrain. Something subtle in his expression had changed. There was the faintest suggestion of a knowing smile, as if events were unfolding exactly as he'd anticipated. The dust clouds grew larger, and the sound of turbocharged diesel engines filled the desert air with the urgency of a command response. The convoy screeched to a halt near the training area with the urgency of a national security response. Heavy doors slammed simultaneously, and the sound of military boots on desert hardpack echoed across the suddenly silent range. Staff Sergeant Kane stood frozen as senior personnel emerged from vehicles with purpose and authority that made his stomach drop. Gunnery Sergeant Valdez stepped out quickly from the lead vehicle, followed by several senior NCOs Kane didn't recognize. But everyone's attention immediately focused on the second vehicle, where a two-star general was climbing out with an expression that mixed profound respect with urgent concern. Major General David Hayes commanded the 1st Marine Division, overseeing all combat and reconnaissance operations. His unexpected personal arrival at a routine drone exercise was unprecedented, causing every Marine on the range to snap to rigid attention. General Hayes walked directly toward Morrison, completely ignoring Kane and the other Marines as if they were invisible. When General Hayes reached Morrison's position, something remarkable happened. The general came to rigid attention and rendered the sharpest, most precise salute that anyone present had ever witnessed. Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Morrison, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance, retired, General Hayes said, his voice booming across the suddenly silent range with authority that made every person present freeze. Sir, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I apologize for the inexcusable disrespect shown to you here today. Morrison slowly returned the salute from his position near the fence line, movement still precise despite his age. General, no apology necessary. These Marines were conducting legitimate training and protecting their operational security. The general held his salute for 5 full seconds before dropping his hand with military precision. Kane felt his knees go weak as reality crashed over him. Master Gunnery Sergeant was the highest enlisted rank in the Marine Corps, reserved for the most exceptional senior NCOs. General Hayes turned to address the stunned Force Recon Marines, who had gathered to witness the unprecedented scene. Marines, allow me to introduce Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Ghost Walker Morrison. He holds the Marine Corps record for longest deep reconnaissance patrol, 23 days behind enemy lines in North Vietnam, without resupply or communication. He is also a recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. The range remained frozen in absolute silence as implications sank in. They had been dismissing one of the most decorated Marines in Corps history. General Hayes continued, his voice growing more respectful. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's reconnaissance techniques are still taught at Marine Corps schools. His ability to track and predict enemy movement using environmental observation was unparalleled during the Vietnam conflict. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with public recognition. "General," Morrison said quietly, "these young Marines have excellent equipment and training. They just need to remember that sometimes the most sophisticated technology works best when combined with fundamental observation skills." General Hayes reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small wooden box. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, this belongs to you. It was lost in the Pentagon mail system for 30 years. He opened the box, revealing the Navy Cross with its distinctive blue and white ribbon. General Hayes carefully pinned the Navy Cross to Morrison's faded red work shirt, the bronze cross looking oddly appropriate against the humble fabric. "Heroes like you don't get forgotten, Master Guns. They just get temporarily misplaced by bureaucracy." Morrison looked down at the medal with emotions playing across his weathered features. "I thought that was lost decades ago, General. I figured the paperwork got buried somewhere in the system." Morrison slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo of a globe and anchor with distinctive parachute wings and scuba bubble beneath, the Force Recon insignia. General Hayes smiled knowingly and began rolling up his own sleeve. As the fabric moved up his arm, another tattoo became visible, a newer version of the same Force Reconnaissance insignia, crisp and clear. "This insignia, Marines," the general said, displaying his arm next to Morrison's, "represents membership in the most elite reconnaissance unit in the Marine Corps. I earned mine in Force Recon in 1995, carrying on traditions established by men like Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison." Staff Sergeant Kane stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper as the full weight of his disrespect became clear. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, I was completely out of line. I apologize for my disrespect and failure to recognize your expertise and service." Morrison gave him a genuine smile that held no trace of anger. "Son, you were protecting your unit's operational security and maintaining proper procedures. That's exactly what a good Marine should do." Morrison looked back toward the sky where the drone would soon reappear. "Just remember that every piece of technology has limitations, but human observation and pattern recognition never become obsolete. The fundamentals don't change. Whether you're tracking enemy scouts in a Vietnamese jungle or hunting drones in a California desert." General Hayes nodded approvingly. "For the next week, Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison will conduct advanced pattern recognition and environmental observation training with this Force Recon Company. Staff Sergeant Kane, you will assist and coordinate the training schedule." As if summoned by Morrison's prediction, the drone appeared exactly where he had indicated, following the thermal column by the Joshua Tree. This time, the Marines were ready. Their coordinated sensor array locked onto the target immediately, tracking its movement through the predicted flight path. The exercise that had frustrated them for 6 hours was completed in minutes, using Morrison's environmental observations combined with their advanced technology. Kane watched in amazement as the drone was successfully tracked and neutralized using the pattern Morrison had identified. "Master Guns, how did you know it would work?" Morrison shouldered his simple hedge clippers with the same dignity he had carried throughout the encounter. "Because, son, nature always tells the truth. You just have to know how to listen." As Morrison prepared to return to his groundskeeping duties, now wearing the Navy Cross on his work shirt, Kane finally understood that true expertise often comes disguised as humility, and that the most effective solutions sometimes combine the oldest wisdom with the newest technology. The Ghost Walker had returned to teach a new generation that observation and patience remain the foundation of all successful reconnaissance operations.